"Don't come near the stage, and please, don't embarrass me." That's what my son said to me the moment I arrived. It wasn't the first time he asked me to tone it down, but this time, something in his voice wasn't nervous. It was ashamed. The invitation came 2 weeks earlier, handwritten by his assistant, not him. A stiff corporate envelope with golden lettering, Annual Legacy Gala, hosted by Brandon E. Ford and Associates. My son had made it. Big time, glass buildings, TV spots, billboards, the kind of success people chase for decades. But to me, he was still just Brandon. My boy who once clung to my muddy boots after school, who sat on my shoulders to watch 4th of July parades. The boy who once cried when I missed a single parent-teacher night because I had a roofing emergency and didn't want the Smiths' living room flooded by morning. Now he was hosting a formal gala, honoring foundations of business and vision, and he invited me, his foundation, or so I thought. I showed up on time. My old suit ironed, hands calloused like always. I even wore the tie he gave me years ago for Father's Day, the one that said, "World's Strongest Man." He had forgotten it. I hadn't. When I arrived, he greeted the mayor first, then a senator, then some TV host, then me. He smiled, but not the smile that says Dad. This one was careful, tight, rehearsed. "Glad you made it," he said quickly, then leaned in with a whisper. "Just stay toward the back, all right? Don't come up, and don't embarrass me." There it was. No thank you. No good to see you. Just don't embarrass me. I looked at him. This tall man in a suit that cost more than my truck? This man whose every opportunity began the day I bent steel beams in the cold to keep food on our table. I said nothing. I just nodded and walked toward the back. People brushed past me like I didn't belong. A young woman asked if I was part of the catering staff. A man placed his coat over my arm without looking, and all I could think about was the first time Brandon brought home a participation ribbon from school and cried because it wasn't first place. I sat him on my lap that night and said, "Son, you don't need to win trophies to make me proud. Just be kind, always." Now here I was, standing in a room full of trophies, and not 1 ounce of kindness. So I stood in the back, quiet, still, and watched the boy I raised pretend he was never mine. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Please tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? If this story speaks to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it. It truly helps us grow this channel and bring you more real emotional stories. Now, let's continue. I walked through the grand glass doors alone. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors so polished they reflected the chandeliers above. Tall floral arrangements that smelled like money. People in tuxedos and dresses that shimmered like they'd never known a day of work in their lives. I took a breath, smelled perfume, wine, ambition. No one looked at me, not even his assistant, who had spoken to me on the phone so many times. She glanced up from her tablet and frowned, as if I had wandered in from the wrong side of the building. Her gaze ran down my suit, modest, pressed but old. Her voice was clipped, sharp. "Are you with the service staff?" I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the irony. Service, that's all I'd ever done. My whole life was service. I built homes I'd never live in, repaired schools I couldn't afford to send my son to, laid down roads for strangers who'd never know my name. If that wasn't service, what was? But I shook my head gently and said only, "I'm his father." There was a pause, the kind that wraps around your ribs and tightens like a belt. She blinked. No apology, no warmth. Just a cold nod toward the far wall. Then, "Please take a seat at the back." And just like that, I was categorized, boxed, labeled, dismissed. I walked past rows of velvet-covered chairs, past tables filled with donors and partners and executives whose hands had never calloused. I passed portraits of my son, larger than life, posed like a prince in his castle, hung beneath banners that read Vision, Power, Legacy. I wondered as I walked which part of that legacy had room for the man who taught him how to hold a hammer. My chair wobbled slightly. It was tucked near the server's entrance between a plant and a curtain that barely opened enough to see the stage. But I sat, quietly, without protest, and I waited. I waited while voices echoed through the hall, waited while his name was spoken with reverence, waited while people toasted to the self-made man at the center of it all. No one spoke to me. No one even asked why I was there, but I knew why I was, not to be seen, not to be celebrated. I came because once, long ago, a little boy wrapped his arms around my neck and said, "When I grow up, I want to be just like you." And tonight, I wanted to see if there was any part of that boy left. The lights dimmed. Applause rolled through the hall like thunder in a ballroom, practiced and polite. A spotlight hit the center of the stage, and there he was, my son, tall, composed, every hair in place, his suit sharp, probably tailored in a city I'd never visited. He stood at the podium with ease, one hand resting casually on the edge, the other gesturing with the confidence of someone used to being listened to. And they did listen. The crowd fell silent. Phones rose to record. Even the servers froze near the walls, heads slightly tilted toward the man they'd been told to admire. He began to speak, his voice calm, polished, the kind of voice that could sell anything, an idea, a product, even a version of the truth. He spoke of ambition, of starting small and dreaming big, of innovation, strategy, vision, of obstacles faced and battles won. He painted a picture of struggle, but there were no names in it, no faces, just him, the lone figure at the center of his own story. He used words I recognized, words I once whispered to him during long drives home from school when he felt lost. Phrases like, build from the ground up, respect every brick, never forget your foundation. But now they were slicked in varnish, polished into slogans, stripped of weight. They were no longer about people. They were about branding. And through it all, he never looked my way. Not once. Not when he mentioned growing up surrounded by hard work. Not when he spoke of humble beginnings. Not even when he paused, smiled wistfully, and said, "There were days I didn't know if I'd make it, but someone always believed in me." The room sighed at that line. The woman in front of me dabbed her eyes. A man beside her clapped early, too moved to wait. But I just sat still, because I knew that someone. It was me, the man he hadn't looked at all evening. As the crowd erupted in applause, I glanced at the screens behind him. A slideshow of his journey played. Childhood photos, school awards, business launches, carefully chosen images that told a sanitized story. But even there, in the backdrop of his life, I wasn't anywhere. I was the invisible scaffolding, the frame no one sees when the building is finished. And I sat in the shadows, wondering how a sun can rise so high and forget the ground that held him. He finished with a powerful line, something about destiny, legacy, the future, and the room stood, a standing ovation. I remained seated, because I wasn't clapping for the man on stage. I was mourning the boy who once ran into my arms covered in sawdust, proudly yelling, "Dad, look, I hammered it myself." And I quietly asked myself a question I never thought I'd ask. When did my son become a stranger with my last name? Dinner was served beneath golden light. Waiters moved like dancers, balancing plates of food I couldn't pronounce. Silverware gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Every table was a stage, every conversation a performance. I sat alone, at the back near the emergency exit, where the draft from the corridor tickled my neck, and the laughter from the main floor felt like it came from another world. I watched him, my son, seated at the head table, surrounded by executives and influencers, men with manicured hands and women with cameras for smile. He laughed easily, tapped glasses with elegance, nodded thoughtfully just as he'd been trained to in whatever finishing school the business world required. But something inside me needed a closer look. A sliver of the old boy, maybe, a glint in his eye that would remind me this was still my child. I wanted to tell him his speech was strong. I wanted to stand beside him, even for a second, as the man who had stood beside him every day before the world ever knew his name. So I rose and approached his table. It wasn't far in distance, but every step felt longer than the years I worked 2 jobs to keep the heat running. I passed men who looked past me, women who glanced and then dismissed. No one stopped me, but the atmosphere thickened, like I was walking through glass. When I reached him, he looked up, startled, not welcoming. His smile twitched, and for a moment I thought it was real, but it wasn't. It was a smile stretched over discomfort, like a sheet trying to cover something broken. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only I could hear. His hand grazed my shoulder, not in affection, in restraint. "Dad," he whispered through clenched teeth, "please, don't come up again. Don't embarrass me." The words hit harder than any blow I'd taken in my life. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. But something in me, something ancient, something quiet, shifted, like the slow, final creak of a wooden beam before it gives way under too much weight. He didn't wait for a response, just turned back to the table and laughed at something someone else had said, as if I was never there, as if I had never been. I stood there for a moment longer, long enough for his assistant to glance over and gently, professionally, motion for me to return to my seat. So I did. I walked back to the far table in the shadows, but I left something behind at that long, glittering table. I left the last remnants of the man who believed his son still remembered. I sat again, hands folded, eyes down. Outside the window, the city lights flickered like stars. I remembered a time when we used to sit on the roof of our small house, eating sandwiches and counting planes overhead. He used to say, "One day I'll fly above all of them." And I used to whisper back, "Just don't forget to look down once in a while." He had flown, all right, but I wasn't sure he even remembered the house he took off from. The dinner music played soft and slow, like a lullaby for strangers. Conversations floated across the hall like perfume, sweet, forgettable, always just out of reach. I watched him from afar, my son, my blood. He moved through the evening like a polished coin, shining on all sides, flipping easily from charm to wit to authority, but never to humility, never to gratitude. I noticed the woman beside him. She was elegant, poised in the way that suggests years of refinement, maybe money, maybe good schools. Her dress was expensive, her smile softer than the others. She didn't laugh as loudly as the rest, didn't perform. She watched, she studied, she leaned in when others spoke, as if truly listening. I had never met her. Not once had he brought her by, not even a phone call, a photo, a mention. And now she was here, seated beside him, her hand brushing his under the table, the diamond on her finger catching every flicker of light in the room. At one point, between speeches and toasts, she turned to him and asked something. I couldn't hear it, but I didn't need to. Her eyes flicked in my direction, her brows lifted, her lips moved. "Is that your dad?" It was a simple question, a natural one, and for a moment he faltered. Not long, barely noticeable to anyone else. But I saw it. A breath held, a jaw tensed, a glance stolen over his shoulder, toward the back, toward me, and then his answer. "He helped raise me." Helped. As if I were a babysitter, a neighbor, a footnote. Not the man who carried him on my shoulders every night for the first 6 years of his life, because he refused to go to bed without watching the stars. Not the man who pawned his wedding ring when the hospital bill came and said nothing to anyone. Not the man who once worked 18 hours straight in the snow, hands cracked and bleeding, just to buy him the bicycle he wanted so badly. He cried himself to sleep over it. I helped raise him. She smiled politely. She didn't question it, just nodded and looked away, her hands still resting on his. But me? I sat in my corner seat, swallowing something heavier than food. Because it wasn't the words that broke me. It was the tone. It was the flicker of shame in his voice. The way he said it softly, quickly, as if brushing dirt from a sleeve. Like I was part of a story he had outgrown. A quiet betrayal. Not loud enough to humiliate, not cruel enough to confront, just enough to cut. And what do you do when your child is ashamed of your truth? I looked down at my hands, still rough, still worn. These hands had built rooms for him to dream in, fixed pipes so his baths were warm, held him through fevers, victories, and heartbreaks. These hands never dropped him, and now they sat in my lap, folded, like they were waiting for permission to feel again. I don't know how long I stared at the tablecloth, but when I looked up again, they were laughing. The woman touched his arm. He leaned closer. The world spun on, and I sat still. I didn't want to leave, but for the first time that night, I didn't want to stay either. Something deep inside me, something made of patience and pride and pain, whispered a truth I wasn't ready to say aloud. My son isn't proud of me anymore. And for the first time in years, I realized that maybe he didn't remember what pride was. A moment later, a young waiter in a crisp vest approached my table, tray balanced perfectly on one hand. He hesitated, glancing at me as if deciding whether to speak. I looked up and saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen all night. Recognition, respect. "You're Mr. Harris, right?" he asked softly. I nodded, surprised. He swallowed. "My dad, he said you fixed our roof last winter, when the ice storm hit. Everyone else quoted prices we couldn't afford. But you showed up at dawn, gloves soaked, ladder wobbling, and you repaired every shingle, for free." The memory of that morning warmed me, the icy wind biting my cheeks as I worked until the sun reached its peak. His family's relief, like a quiet blessing. I'd done it because his father was my friend, because a man's home should shelter his children, because that's what fathers do. The waiter bowed his head, voice hushed. "He wanted me to thank you. He said you were a good man." I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, tasting the bitter sweetness of pride. My heart swelled and cracked, ached with a longing I'd buried deep. Here in this gala, among the glitter and glass, was someone remembering the man I'd been, remembering the hands that built, the shoulders that bore burdens, the silent sacrifice that never sought reward. I managed a small smile, the kind that carried both gratitude and sorrow. But then I glanced back at the head table. My son sat there, mid-conversation, his laughter bright and distant. He looked away the moment our eyes met, as though my presence embarrassed him all over again. The waiter slipped away, leaving me in the hush of marble and fading music. I sat alone once more, cradling the memory of another life, one where love wasn't measured in speeches or applause, but in shingles, replaced and roofs mended without a second thought. And as I fingered the edge of my napkin, I realized how far we'd drifted, from two silhouettes against a starry sky, to strangers separated by ambition and shame. Yet even now, I believed, against every echo of loneliness, that the foundation we'd laid together could still bear the weight of reconciliation. Because even in the gilded back rows of a father's exile, the truth of who we are can't be silenced by fear or pride. It only waits, quiet, patient, ready to be remembered. I slipped outside into the cool night air, the gala's laughter and clinking glasses muffled behind me. The city lights of downtown shimmered against glass towers, but all I saw was the flashing memory of a forgotten dream. My heart pounded as I dug into my breast pocket and pulled out my worn leather wallet. My fingers trembled when I found it, a single faded photograph folded at the creases. I unfolded it gently, careful not to tear the thin paper. There he was, 8 years old, shirt smeared with sawdust, bare feet planted firmly on the gravel beside a half-built porch. His small hand gripped my yellow hard hat, eyes bright with wonder. I stooped next to him, one arm around his shoulder, the other holding a hammer just the right size for his little fist. In that moment, the whole world felt possible. He looked up at me then, dirt streaking his face, and whispered with that wide-eyed awe only a child can muster, "I want to be like you, Dad." That promise echoed in my chest now, resonating with the steady beat of every sacrifice I'd made. The long nights under fluorescent lights, fixing broken pipes. The weekends spent hauling shingles up ladders instead of watching ball games. The empty stomachs so he could have an extra book for school. All those years, every drop of sweat, every aching muscle had been for him. I pressed the photo to my heart, feeling the thin paper against my chest like a fragile lifeline. The edges were frayed, the colors dulled by time, but the truth in that image was still vivid. Back then, he saw me not just as a father, but as a hero, someone to look up to, someone to trust, someone to follow. I closed my eyes, breathing in the crisp air, trying to summon the warmth of that day. The memory cut through the cold like a beacon, reminding me of the bond we once shared, a bond I feared was lost in the glittering hall behind me. I slipped the photo back into my wallet and stood taller, shoulders squared. The ache in my chest was raw, but it fueled something fierce inside me, a determination to remind him who we were, where we started, and how deeply I believed in him. With a final glance at the starless sky, I tucked the wallet away and took a step back toward the light, knowing that the next moment would change everything. I slipped through the doors once more, my heart pounding like a hammer against steel. No longer content to linger in the shadows, I carried the weight of that photograph close to my chest, its memory burning brighter than any chandelier overhead. I moved past tables and torchlit smile, past servers' polite nods and guests who barely glanced at me, until I stood at the foot of the stage. The moment I stepped into the spotlight, the room fell silent, an ocean of voices stilled by my presence. The music cut off mid-phrase, as if it too recognized the gravity of this return. All eyes snapped toward me, and in that hush I felt every heartbeat reverberate in my ears. My son was mid-speech, the words he'd rehearsed so many times hanging in the air like fragile ornaments. He froze, gaze flicking from audience member to audience member until it landed on me. His composure cracked, just a hairline fracture, and I saw the boy beneath the businessman, uncertain, vulnerable, caught between pride and regret. I didn't reach for the microphone. I didn't need to. Silence spoke louder than any address. I simply held up the faded photograph, its edges soft with time. The image of a muddy 8-year-old, clutching my helmet and my hand, was all the testament I needed. The crowd leaned forward as one, the collective breath held, waiting to see how the story would end. My son's voice trembled as he whispered, "Dad," but no other words came. His shame, his guilt, his love, all unspoken, rippled outward, palpable in every corner of that hall. I saw tears gather at the edges of his eyes, saw the steel in his shoulders loosen for the first time that night. In that stretch of stillness, something shifted. The polished veneer of success wavered and shattered, revealing a bond forged in sweat and sacrifice. Every accolade on those walls, every toast and every speech evaporated in the face of a single truth. No monument erected by wealth or fame could ever outshine the legacy of a father's love. And as the audience watched, hushed and wide-eyed, I stepped back from the stage, the photograph still raised like a silent banner. I didn't need applause. I only needed him to remember where he'd come from, and the man who had carried him there. I held the photograph aloft, its edges soft and worn against the glare of the lights, and in that moment, the air itself seemed to pause. The chatter ceased, silverware stilled halfway to mouths, and even the shifting of chairs sounded like thunder in the hush that fell over the ballroom. My son stood frozen at the podium, the practiced curve of his shoulders slackening as if struck by a winter wind. His eyes, so accustomed to scanning markets and strategies, locked onto that small image of himself at 8 years old, barefoot, face streaked with sawdust and pride, gripping my hand as though it were the only anchor he knew. For a heartbeat, he looked not at his suit or his accolades, but at the raw truth captured in faded ink, a boy who had dreamed with me under an open sky, who once believed that my work boots were as noble as any crown. The audience watched him, mouths agape, caught between awe and awkwardness as they processed a story more real than any speech they'd just heard. My son's breath caught. His fingertips twitched at the edge of the podium. He looked at me, then back at the photo, and I saw the memory flicker behind his eyes, the lopsided grin he wore when I lifted him on my shoulders, the way his small voice had tripped over the words, "I want to be like you." Turning toward the crowd, I lowered my voice until it was nearly a murmur, but it carried like a stone dropped into still water. This boy once wanted to be like his father. I just came to see if he still does. My words floated across the room, steady and resonant, echoing off marble walls lined with portraits of success. But here was something more elemental than power or profit, a bond forged in sweat, sacrifice, and countless unseen moments. I watched as his composure cracked, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, glinting in the spotlight. He remained silent, yet the weight of what I'd shown him spoke volumes, louder than any admission he could muster. In that silence lay all he hadn't said, the guilt for his harsh words, the regret for the times he turned away, the realization that every skyscraper he built rested on the calloused hands of the man who stood before him now. Around us the audience shifted, some rising to their feet in stunned reverence, others wiping their eyes. But I only saw my son, no longer the polished figure on stage, but the vulnerable boy who once clung to my belt buckle as we navigated life's storms together. And in his widened gaze, I saw the question I'd been waiting to hear. Was the bond we shared still real? I held the photograph a moment longer, then gently folded it, tucking it away in my jacket. Without another word, I stepped back, leaving him standing amidst the most honest truth he'd ever faced, and trusting that, in that quiet reckoning, he would remember who he was and who I had always been for him. The room trembled with the echoes of my words, and now the aftermath spread through the crowd like ripples on a pond. Some stood and clapped, their hands bold and approving, strangers moved by the raw honesty of a father's love. Others stared at their plates, eyes downcast as if grappling with guilt for applauding a truth that cut deeper than any speech. His fiancée, poised moments before as the picture of grace, stood motionless. Her delicate grip on his arm slackened as she watched him wrestle with the revelation. In her stillness was the understanding that this moment was larger than them both, a reckoning neither had anticipated. My son stared at the folded photograph in the crook of my elbow, the image of his younger self heavy in his mind. He glanced at me, that sturdy presence he'd once leaned on without hesitation. Then he glanced away, face tightening, cheeks hollowing as shame sculpted his features into something small, something fragile. He sank low behind the podium, as though he could make himself disappear beneath its polished surface. I felt the weight of every gaze in the hall, some curious, some condemning, some compassionate. Yet none of that mattered. What mattered was the space between us, the invisible chasm carved by unspoken hurts, by ambition that blinded him to the man who shaped his earliest dreams. I remained where I was, in the hush just beyond the stage, and watched him shrink under the weight of his own success. He took a tentative step forward, then stopped, uncertainty dragging at the edges of his resolve. The grand banners behind him, words like legacy and vision, fluttered in the sudden quiet, hollow without context. Because legacy wasn't a glass plaque. Vision wasn't a tagline printed on invitations. In that moment, the room was divided not by class or status, but by truth. On one side stood those who clapped for a performance. On the other, those who recognized a story more real than any facade. And between them, the father and son whose bond had been tested on one stage, and whose reconciliation would be the true headline. My son's gaze lifted, meeting mine for the first time in hours. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in the weight of realization. He swallowed, and I sensed the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. He was no longer the polished speaker, no longer the eager executive. He was simply a son, standing before his father, exposed and waiting. And as the applause faded into a hush, I knew the next moment would define us both. Not with words rehearsed, but with the quiet steps two men must take to bridge a divide, deeper than any ballroom ever held. I felt no need to bask in the aftermath of revelations or wait for the echo of applause to die away. In the stillness that followed, I bent and laid the photograph gently atop the table before him. It landed with a soft thud against the white linen, a quiet, unspoken challenge and an offer all at once. I didn't linger to watch his reaction. I didn't shout accusations or plead for forgiveness. I simply turned away, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes trailing me as I walked down the center aisle. As I passed the head table, I heard the scrape of a chair as he rose, tentatively, uncertainly, but I kept my pace steady. The chandeliers cast long shadows ahead of me, and in those shifting shapes I saw memories of another life. Afternoons teaching him to swing a hammer, evenings tipping back windows so he could chase fireflies in the yard. The time he cried over a broken toy, and I stayed up all night to fashion a new one from scraps. I reached the exit without a backward glance. Outside, the cold night air greeted me like an old friend, sharp and real. The gala's golden glow receded behind me, as if I had stepped out of someone else's story. My heart thudded where pride and sorrow met, yet inside that quiet ache, I felt a calm certainty. I had reminded him of our truth, without anger or spectacle. I closed the door softly, the click echoing like a punctuation mark on the night. I leaned against the frame for a moment, hands in my coat pockets, breathing in the cool air. Above me, the city skyline glittered, towers of glass and steel that would stand long after this evening, but none of them would ever hold the memories we made in the dust and sweat of simpler days. In the distance, I heard faint footsteps behind me, hesitant, approaching. I didn't turn. I only listened, feeling the ground beneath me, solid, unwavering. No grand gestures remained to be made. The photograph lay behind me on that table, a testament to who we were and who we could still become. And as the night wrapped around the building, I stood there, a father at the edge of possibility, knowing that true strength often speaks in silence, and that sometimes the loudest declarations are made simply by walking away. 2 days later, my phone buzzed across the silent morning. I stared at the screen, heart hammering, not with the rush of expectation, but with the quiet ache of hope. His name glowed there, and I answered before I could second-guess myself. "Dad, I didn't mean what I said." His voice trembled through the line, softer than I'd ever heard it. I was nervous. I didn't want people to judge me. His words tumbled out, fragile confessions tangled with regret. I closed my eyes and let the hum of traffic outside my window fill the space between us. Remembering the nights I stayed up praying he'd know love, not shame. When he finished, I paused, turning the phone over in my hand as if it might guide my response. Finally I spoke, not with reproach, but with the gentle firmness of a man who'd weathered storms and learned that true character is revealed in the quiet after the thunder. "And what do you judge me as, son?" His silence on the other end was a long, unsteady breath. I imagined him pacing by the oak desk in his high-rise office. The city sprawled beneath him like a glittering sea, yet none of that grandeur could shield him from the weight of truth.
I waited, letting him feel the strength in my stillness, just as I'd once waited for him to learn to walk, ready to steady him when he stumbled.
When he spoke again, his voice was different, more vulnerable, stripped of pretense. He confessed his shame, his ambition, his fear of being seen as only a father. But beneath it all, I heard the son I'd always known, the boy who believed in me without question. In that moment, miles and memories melted away, and all that remained was the bond neither time nor pride could break. I let him find the words he needed, guiding him back to the promise we made long ago. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I realized that sometimes the most powerful reconciliation happens not on a stage, but in the simple act of asking and answering the questions that matter most. He arrived at my door the next evening without warning. No flashing cameras, no rigid posture beneath a tuxedo. He stood there in soft light, the city's hum muted behind him, a man unmasked and unsure. I opened the door and saw the fatigue in his eyes, the tight line of his jaw, and I knew this conversation carried the weight of every unspoken moment between us. He held out his hand, not the confident handshake of a businessman, but the hesitant gesture of a son seeking something he thought he'd lost. "Why did you carry that photo?" he asked, voice low, barely more than a question to himself. In that silence, I led him inside, past the photographs lining the hallway. Family snapshots faded like whispers of what once was. I didn't answer immediately. I stepped into the living room and sat on the worn leather armchair where he had crawled onto my lap as a child. I placed the photo on the coffee table between us, its edges curling with memory. The lamp cast a gentle pool of light over our past, the dusty construction site, the wide eyes of a boy who saw his world in my hands. "Because I carry you," I said softly, settling into the chair's familiar creak, "even when you forget to carry me." My words hung between us like a promise. He sank onto the sofa, facing me, gaze fixed on the photograph. In his silence, I heard the echo of his childhood laughter, the rustle of his small hand in mine, and the endless summer sky that once felt big enough for our dreams. He reached forward, fingertips trembling as they brushed the photo's surface, tracing the lines of our younger selves. In that moment, the distance built by success and shame dissolved. Two men, father and son, reunited by the simplest truth. No matter how far he flew, I would always be the ground beneath his feet, and he would forever be the heart I carried. We sat together by the dying embers of the fireplace, the amber glow flickering across his face and casting long shadows that danced on the walls. He held the photograph gently in his hands, as though it might shatter if squeezed too hard. Outside, the night was quiet, but inside, the room hummed with truths neither of us had dared speak until now. He looked up at me, eyes reflecting both the firelight and a lifetime of unspoken regret. "You built everything I have," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I just added glass." He let the words hang, fragile as candle smoke. I sensed the weight behind them. Acknowledgement, apology, gratitude, all entwined in a single breath. I reached out and placed my hand over his. The lines in his palm echoed the lines in mine. Work, perseverance, sacrifice etched into our very skin. "Legacy isn't in walls, son," I said softly, my voice steady even as my heart swelled. "It's in hands that never dropped you, even when you tried to let go." He closed his eyes, and I saw the memory sweep through him. The first time he learned to walk, clutching my fingers. The nights I tiptoed into his room to soothe the nightmare. The countless days I labored so he could dream without fear. All those moments, unseen by the world, were the true foundation of everything he'd achieved. He opened his eyes again, and for the first time in years, I saw the boy I knew. Humble, hopeful, unafraid. He set the photograph on the mantel, where it rested beside new pictures of his own success, towers of glass and steel glittering like promises fulfilled. Yet in that quiet room, none of it mattered as much as the invisible ties that bound us. We sat in silence until the fire faded to embers, 2 generations reconciled by a truth more enduring than any building. Love is the real legacy, and in that moment, surrounded by warmth and memory, I knew our bond would never need gilded halls or polished speeches again. It was simply enough to sit, to remember, and to carry each other home. He rose from the sofa without a word, the photograph still resting on the mantel, as if it had done its work. His shoulders were heavy with unspoken apologies, his eyes glistening in the last glow of the fire. Then, without hesitation, he crossed the small distance between us and wrapped his arms around me. It was the same embrace from years ago, tight, desperate, full of the boy's need for comfort and the man's need for forgiveness. I felt his hands clutch at the back of my coat, as though he were holding on to more than just a father's shoulder, holding on to a past he feared had slipped through his fingers. I held him just as firmly, feeling the rise and fall of his breath against my chest. The crackle of the logs punctuated the moment like a heartbeat, reminding us both that this was real, that we were here, that love still bound us. In that embrace, ambition and shame fell away, leaving only the unbreakable thread of blood and memory. After what felt like a lifetime, I whispered into his ear, my voice low and steady. You never embarrassed me, son. You just forgot who taught you how to stand tall. His arms tightened, then loosened as he pulled back just enough for me to see his face. His eyes shone with tears and relief, and in their depths I saw the boy from the photo, full of wonder, courage, and love. He nodded slowly, the single movement carrying more meaning than any apology he could have spoken. In the hush that followed, as the fire's glow softened and the night settled around us, we simply stood together, father and son, equal at last in our shared understanding. No further words were needed. In that silence, he finally remembered who he was and who I had always been for him, the man who built his world and the father who never stopped believing in his son's heart.